Good mythical afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yet again, this is Mr. Ayala with another video for you. This is 10.4, Van Buren, Harrison, and Tyler 2. As always, please make sure that you are making sure to listen to the information as well as writing it down, because it's a lot more helpful to pay attention than just to space out or listen to random YouTube videos. Please sit back, relax, learn a couple things, and be merry. So, our objective as usual, you'll be able to describe what occurred after Andrew Jackson killed the bank. You'll be able to describe the Panic of 1832 and the rise of the Whig Party in the United States. So, first things, prosperity becomes panic. So, under President Andrew Jackson, the average American citizen actually becomes very prosperous, and they actually increase their wealth. But because of all of this, and he kept printing out money because the national bank is having issues, inflation begins to occur. So that means that because there's so much currency floating around, that your money becomes worth less, and prices begin to rise. So this is that whole concept of that the purchasing power of said currency or money gets reduced. So from there, what happens is we go to a new election in 1836, and President Andrew Jackson's vice president, Van Buren, this dapper gentleman over here with the mutton chops, was elected president. And within a year, in 1837, we get through the first panic. And what a panic is when people fear that the economy is going to become, we're going to go into a recession or into a depression, and they start freaking out about the economy and how it's going to change throughout time. So I do apologize about those multiple jump cuts, but back to what we were talking about. So in the Panic of 1837, because of everyone being so concerned about the economy going into a depression, people begin to bring their paper money to these banks and begin to demand gold. And at this time, your money our currency, I should say, was backed by gold. So you can take a nickel or a dime or a dollar and go into the bank and say, hey, I would like this amount of gold back. And because so many people did what we call the run on the banks and wanted this gold, the banks began to run out of the gold. And what ends up happening is the banks slowly begin to collapse. And then the United States government even tries to get all their own money out of these state pet banks that Andrew Jackson created. But they could not get that out, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So from there, a depression ends up ensuing, which is a severe economic slump. So first thing that happens is people had very little money, and because people had no money, they couldn't buy anything. Thus, businesses begin to close. And because businesses begin to close, people begin to lose their wealth. And because of them losing their wealth, they begin to move into shelters or end up being frozen on the streets because they have no place to go. People begin to starve because they can't afford to buy any food, because they can't have a job, because no one can buy anything. And because of this economic hardships, the politics begins to change, because people have a tendency to vote based upon their economic wants and needs. And if the Democratic Party at this time wasn't doing that, a new political party needed to be created, which gets us to the Whig Party. So what we have is Senators Henry Clay and Daniel Webster say that the U.S. government should try to stimulate and help the economy. But the Democrats at this time disagree. President Van Buren states, the less government interferes with private pursuits, the better for general prosperity. And because of this said not wanting to help anyone, people begin to blame the President Van Buren on this panic. And they begin to blame him, and he was very unlikely to win re-election. And in reality, the panic and this depression occurred because of Andrew Jackson's attacks on the national bank. So from there, these Whig parties was created to fight Jackson and his demand on the increase of executive power. So the Whigs will end up running a gentleman known as William Henry Harrison, who you should know from when we talked about the Battle of Tippecanoe and Tecumseh earlier in this year. So, and the Whigs run him, and they also run the Vice President John Tyler. And their slogan ends up becoming Old Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Kind of a nice little rhythm pattern there. So the Whigs end up taken a playbook out of Andrew Jackson's run for the presidency. They run on personalities. And if you're looking at William Henry Harrison versus Van Buren, Van Buren's quite a boring guy when you really spoke to him. While William Henry Harrison has fought Native Americans, he tried to choke out Tecumseh across the table during one of the treaties, and then later ends up killing Tecumseh during the War of 1812. And because of the economic hardships under the Democratic policies, William Henry Harrison, who's a Whig, wins and becomes the 9th president of the United States. But there's a problem because Harrison's opponents kept telling him that he was an old man. This old man should not become president. He's like, old man, I'll show you who's an old man. So he's going to speak for 2 hours in the pouring cold rain in Washington, D.C. without a hat and no coat. So, of course, he gets sick and dies of pneumonia within 30 days. So then you have John Tyler, who becomes president right after. And John Tyler was his vice president just because they didn't know who to run with him. And we'll keep the rest for the next unit.